I was a simple man, living a simple life. My wife Sarah was the epitome of beauty and grace. We had a 5-year-old little boy named Timmy, who was the apple of our eyes. I worked as a sales manager in a multinational company, and my boss, Mr. Johnson, was a man I admired and respected. My life was about to take a turn I never expected. Before we get into the stories, don't forget to hit the bell icon at the top of the screen and subscribe to our channel. I had just joined this company 3 months ago, and little did I know that it would end up being the biggest mistake of my life. It was a normal day when my wife accompanied me to drop me off at the office. That's when we met my boss, Mr. Johnson. From the moment we met him, I noticed that his eyes were fixed on my wife the entire time. Even though he was 61, I thought he was really friendly. Almost as if he was trying to flirt with her, he kept shaking her hand. As I looked at my wife, I was unable to tell if she felt embarrassed or not. Within just 2 minutes of meeting her, he started asking personal questions about her background and education. I quickly finished up the introduction and reminded my wife to head back home. As we were about to enter the hallway, he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You have the most beautiful wife in the world. Take good care of her." At first, I thought he was just sincerely complimenting me, but little did I know that his true intentions would soon be revealed. Over the next few months, Mr. Johnson began to get closer to me. Initially, I did not suspect any ulterior motives or dirty plans involving my wife. There was a small party at the office, and he invited all the employees along with their partners. Reluctantly, I had to bring my wife Sarah to the party. It was there that I first met Mr. Johnson's wife, a young lady whom I didn't know he had married. Throughout the entire party, I noticed that his eyes were staying focused continuously on my wife. Despite feeling uncomfortable, I chose to ignore it because I did not want to risk losing my job if I asked him something about he always stared at my wife, even though sometimes I thought it was just my imagination. When the party ended, I decided to confront him directly. He merely smiled and said, "Don't worry, I'm just admiring your wife's beauty." I thanked him for his honesty, but I was still left with a feeling of unease. After the party, Mr. Johnson invited me and my wife to his home. I didn't want to accept the invitation, but I felt obligated to do so because he was my boss. On the way back home, I asked my wife if she had noticed his strange behavior towards her. Surprisingly, she said she had not noticed anything, and even she liked Mr. Johnson and his wife. When I asked her about the dinner invitation, she insisted that we should go because he was our boss and we needed to fulfill his request. I started to think that maybe I was overthinking things, so I decided to forget about my suspicions and agreed to go to his home for dinner with my wife. 3 days later, when we arrived at Mr. Johnson's home, his wife was nowhere to be found. It struck me as odd. Once again, he greeted my wife, constantly kissing her hand while staring into her eyes in a peculiar manner. We sat down for dinner, and I asked about his wife's absence. He casually mentioned that she had gone out with her girlfriend for the night. After dinner, I suddenly felt dizzy and lost consciousness. When I woke up, I found myself laying on the bed in a bedroom. It was a bizarre experience since I had never passed out before. Shortly after my wife and Mr. Johnson entered the room, I asked him what had happened to me. He explained that it was just a momentary loss of consciousness due to dehydration, according to the doctor he had called. As I was asking where she was, I noticed that there was some sort of nervousness in her eyes when she replied. My wife and I left as soon as I told her to leave, and we were on our way. I was thinking about why my wife left me in this situation and what she is doing as I tried to think my way through the situation. Then I asked, but she said she was in the washroom. I didn't believe her story and asked her again. She repeated the same answer, and I decided to let it go. I had a feeling that something was off, but I could not figure out what it was. After that day, my wife's behavior became increasingly suspicious from that point forward. There were many activities that we used to enjoy together, such as physical intimacy, casual conversations, and going out for dinner, that she started participating in. Her relationship with me started to deteriorate as she spent more time outside with her girlfriends, leading to less time spent with me. I started to worry and asked her about it, but she always had excuses. I began to feel like she was keeping something from me, and I became suspicious of her actions. Meanwhile, Mr. Johnson's behavior towards me again became increasingly strange. He always seemed to insist on sending me on business trips, which initially seemed like good news, as it meant new tasks and potential promotion opportunities. However, I could not shake off the feeling that something was off. One evening, after returning from work, Timmy ran towards me, his face beaming with excitement. "Daddy, Daddy, Mr. Johnson came home today," he exclaimed. I was taken aback. "Mr. Johnson? Why would he come here, Timmy?" I asked, trying to hide my surprise. "Mommy called him Daddy," he replied innocently. My heart pounded in my chest. I dismissed it as a child misunderstanding, but deep down I knew something was amiss. I put on a brave face and smiled, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to confront my wife about the situation as soon as I had a chance. The next day, I left work early. I told Sarah I had a late meeting and would not be home until late. Anyway, when I finally returned home after a long day at the office, it was already evening and she was getting ready. When I asked her about her plans, she casually mentioned that she had plans to meet an old friend at that night. I pretended to be calm and collected in front of her, but deep down I was determined to uncover the truth. It was my intention to follow her when she left. And so, as soon as she departed, I discreetly trailed behind her. She led me to the rather unfamiliar and peculiar area. After 30 minutes of driving, she eventually pulled over near a small motel. My curiosity piqued as I observed her entering one of the rooms. My heart sinks. As I was moving forward to the room, my heart pounding in my chest. When I tried to listen from inside, I could hear soft laughter coming from the room. I tiptoed towards the sound, my heart pounding louder with each step. As I break the door of the room, I saw Sarah and Mr. Johnson sitting close together on the bed. I felt a lump in my throat. I couldn't believe my eyes, my presence startling them. "What's going on here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Sarah looked at me, her eyes wide with shock. Mr. Johnson quickly withdrew his hand from hers and stood up. "I can explain," he started, but I held up my hand, silencing him. "I don't want to hear any explanations. I want you to leave," I said, pointing towards the door. Mr. Johnson nodded, quickly gathering his things and leaving. I turned to Sarah, my heart aching. "How could you, Sarah?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. In the end of the conversation, Sarah began to cry, pleading for my forgiveness as she cried. She told me that it was a mistake, that it did not mean anything to her. In spite of this, I was not able to believe her. The trust between the two parties had been broken. I took her clothes and locked the room. I had decided to call her parents, so I suddenly messaged them to come over. Throughout this time, I started asking her how and when she did this. Additionally, I began recording our conversation on my phone to capture everything she was going to say. She proceeded to tell me the whole story, which started the day she met my boss, Johnson, at the office. She found him very attractive, and they would often meet at parties and dinners. Somehow, she managed to get his number. In my mind, I suspected that it wasn't a coincidence when we went to have dinner with my boss and I became unconscious. So, I asked her while she started crying. I asked her again and she confessed that she did not want him to do what he did because she wanted to spend time with me. My boss had added a sleeping pill to my wine glass that day and they took advantage of the situation. I was angry and felt betrayed. I asked her why she did not tell me before, and she said she was scared of my reaction. She revealed her crime, sharing every detail from the beginning until now. She had no idea that I was recording our conversation. When her parents arrived, I played the audio for them, and they were extremely embarrassed while listening to every single detail. Her mother cursed her, and I left her there with her parents. The following weeks were a blur. I filed for divorce and fought for custody of Timmy. It was a tough battle, but I was determined to protect my son. I did not want him to grow up in a broken home, but I also did not want him to grow up with a mother who could betray his father so easily. In the end, I won custody of Timmy. Sarah was allowed supervised visits, but she chose to leave town instead. I was heartbroken, but I knew it was for the best. I focused on raising Timmy, making sure he had a stable and loving environment. As for Mr. Johnson, I quit my job and found a new one. I didn't want to work for a man who had no respect for his employees' personal lives. It was a tough decision, but it was the right one. In the end, I learned a valuable lesson. Trust is fragile. Once broken, it's hard to rebuild. But I also learned that I was stronger than I thought. I was able to pick up the pieces of my broken heart and move on. I was able to provide a loving home for my son. Despite the betrayal, I also saw the strength of my family and friends. With their support, I was able to keep going and find the courage to start anew. I'm a survivor and I can be proud of that. And most importantly, I learned that no matter what happens, I'll always put my son first, because he's the most important person in my life. And nothing, not even a betrayal, can change that.